Next is approval of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Okay, agenda is approved. We have one consent resolution to approve the minutes from September 19, 2023 Talent and Recruitment Committee meeting. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, say nay. Right, motion passes. All right, as we move towards the end of the calendar year and prepare for the next, I just wanted to state that many have been hard at work in scheduling interviews, conducting interviews, and preparing for this meeting. I'm thankful for the work of several employees. In particular, I'll just give a shout out to Rachel Sanchez, who's been very helpful to many throughout the past couple of months as it relates to those who applied to serve. There was lots of technology glitches that she assisted with, as well as working with staff and board members. The end of December tends to be when many volunteer seat terms expire for a variety of boards and committees of the county, and that's the reason why we have a large number of action items before us today. So the first action item is to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the names of Nathan Pyle, James Tanis, James Wysocki, and to place one to fill one agricultural seat vacancy beginning January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2026. First, can we get a motion on this?
So moved. Second.
Okay, the interview subcommittee is recommending Nathan Pyle. We will need to take a roll call vote on this, and you should state one name from this list. First, is there any discussion? All right, seeing none, Rachel, will you please take the roll?
Mr. Belknap, sorry.
Nathan Pyle.
Mrs. Curran,
Pyle.
Mr. Bonema,
Pyle.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Pyle.
Mr. Zylstra,
Nathan Pyle.
Mr. Moss,
Nathan Pyle.
Mrs. Ebel,
Nathan Pyle.
Mrs. Miedema,
Nathan Pyle.
Nathan Pyle.
Right, thank you. All right, so we will forward the recommendation of Nathan Pyle onto the Board of Commissioners. Our second action item today is to place, looking at Community Corrections Advisory Board, is to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the names of Heath White and to select one to fill one MDOC seat vacancy between January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2025. First, can I have a motion on this?
So moved.
Second.
All right, there's been a motion and a second. Is there any discussion?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
just I'm assuming that Philip and Michelle are ineligible because they don't work at MDOC, right? Is that the
They were
reason?
ineligible based on the criteria that were needed. So anytime you'll see an ineligible on here meant
Right.
that anything that meant with the bylaws that they needed to
Right.
meet or criteria, they did not meet those, so they didn't get an interview.
So, but the criteria is you have to work at MDOC, or how does that work? I know we're filling one MDOC seat vacancy. Is that the requirement to work at MDOC?
I don't have that information right in front of me at the moment,
Okay.
Commissioner Zylstra. I just know that as we went through the screening process, I made sure that if they did not meet the criteria, and it wasn't me overseeing it, it was
Sure.
the department heads,
Okay, Cool.
and along with their clerk's office to make sure that they met either the criteria that was involved in the bylaws, that was stipulated.
Okay.
And so they didn't meet, so
Okay.
the criteria, and so they didn't forward on.
Okay. Cool.
Any other discussion? All right, if we could please take a roll call vote again.
Mr. Belknap,
Heath White.
Mrs. Curran,
White.
Mr. Bonema,
Heath White.
Mrs. Rhodey,
White.
Mr. Zylstra,
Heath White?
Mr. Moss,
Heath White.
Mrs. Ebel,
Heath White.
Mrs. Miedema.
Heath White.
Heath White has the most votes.
All right, we will recommend Heath White to the Board of Commissioners for the Community Corrections Advisory Board, the MDOC seat. Next up is also another seat on the Community Corrections Advisory Board, and this one is to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the name of Matt Messer and to select one to fill one Chief of Police seat vacancy between January 1, 2024, and ending December 31, 2025. First, can I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Right. Any discussion? Seeing none, can we please take a roll call vote?
Mr. Belknap,
Matt Messer.
Mrs. Curran,
Messer.
Mr. Bonema,
Matt Messer.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Messer.
Mr. Zylstra,
Matt Messer.
Mr. Moss,
Matt Messer.
Mrs. Ebel,
Matt Messer.
Mrs. Medema.
Matt Messer.
Matt Messer has the most votes.
All right, we will recommend him to the full Board of Commissioners. Action item number 4 is from the Ottawa County Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy Committee, also known as SEDS. It's to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the names of Benjamin Genzer, Ryan Anderson, and David Cawthorn, and to select one to fill one private sector seat vacancy between January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2024. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Support.
Any discussion? All right, just as a reminder to select one to fill this seat. If we could please take a roll call vote, Rachel?
Mr. Belknap,
Benjamin Genser.
Mrs. Curran,
Genser.
Mr. Bonema,
Benjamin Genser.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Genser.
Mr. Zylstra,
David Cawthorn.
Mr. Moss,
Ben Genser.
Mrs. Ebel,
Ben Genser.
Mrs. Medema.
Benjamin Genzer.
With 7 votes, Benjamin Genser.
All right, we'll forward Benjamin Genzer's name on to the recommendation for the full Board of Commissioners. Proceeding on to action item 5, we have the Ottawa County Groundwater Board to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the name of Alexander Shavoda and to select one to fill one Ag Conservation Technical Assistant seat vacancy beginning January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2026. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, if you could please take a roll call vote, Rachel.
Mr. Belknap,
Alexander Svoboda.
Mrs. Curran,
Zavoda.
Mr. Bonema,
Alexander Shaboda.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Zavoda.
Mr. Zylstra,
Svoboda.
Mr. Moss,
Svoboda.
Mrs. Ebel,
Alexander Zavoda.
Mrs. Medema.
Alexander.
8 votes for Alexander.
All right, thank you. We will recommend Alexander Shavoda onto the Board of Commissioners. Item number 6 is also from Ottawa County Groundwater Board. And that is to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the names of Lee Machila and Stephen Hexel, and to select one to fill one well drilling seat vacancy between January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2026. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Support.
Any discussion? All right, remember to vote for one for the seat.
Mr. Belknap,
Lee Michella.
Mrs. Curran,
Michelle.
Mr. Bonema,
Lee Machila.
She.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Machila.
Mr. Zylstra,
Machila.
Mr. Moss,
Lee Machila.
Mrs. Ebel,
Lee Machila.
Mrs. Medema.
Lima Sheila.
8 votes for Lee Machidema.
All right, Sheila. We will recommend Lee Machila onto the full Board of Commissioners. Item number 6 is also from Ottawa County Groundwater Board. It is to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the names of Carrie Rivette, Mark Baker, Elaine Isley, and to select one to fill one Environmental Conservation Technical Assistant seat vacancy beginning January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2026. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, remember to please list one name that you would like to be in that seat.
Mr. Belknap,
Carrie Rivette.
Mrs. Curran,
Rivette.
Mr. Bonema,
Carrie Rivette.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Rivette.
Mr. Zylstra,
Rivette.
Mr. Moss,
Carrie Rivette.
Mrs. Ebel,
Carrie Rivette.
Mrs. Medema,
Carrie Rivette.
8 votes for Carrie Rivette.
All right, we'll move forward. Carrie Rivette's name is our recommended name onto the full Board of Commissioners. Item 8, also got Ottawa County Groundwater Board is to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the name of Adam Ellenboss and to select one to fill one local unit of government with a 3-year term seat vacancy beginning January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2026. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, can we please take a roll call vote?
Mr. Belknap,
Adam Ellenboss.
Mrs. Curran,
Ellen Boss.
Mr. Bonema,
Adam Ellenboss.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Ellen Boss.
Mr. Zylstra,
Adam Ellenboss,
Mr. Moss,
Adam Ellenboss.
Mrs. Ebel,
Ellen Boss.
Mrs. Medema,
Adam Ellenboss.
8 votes for Adam Ellenboss.
We'll recommend Adam Ellenboss then onto the full Board of Commissioners. Action item number 9, also from Ottawa County Groundwater Board, is to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the name of Frank Johnson and to select one to fill one local unit of government for a 1-year term seat vacancy beginning January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2024. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Support.
Any discussion? Seeing none, if we could please take a roll call vote.
Mr. Belknap,
Frank Johnson.
Mrs. Curran,
Johnson.
Mr. Bonema,
Frank Johnson.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Johnson.
Mr. Zylstra,
Johnson,
Mr. Moss,
Frank Johnson.
Mrs. Ebel,
Frank Johnson.
Mrs. Medema.
Frank Johnson.
That's 8 from Frank Johnson.
Right, we will recommend Frank Johnson onto the full Board of Commissioners. Action item 10, one last one for Ottawa County Groundwater Board is to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the names of Mark Baker, Elaine Isley, Carrie Rivette, and to select one to fill one scientific community seat vacancy beginning January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2026. Is
So
there
moved.
Support.
any discussion? All right, can we please take a roll call vote and please select one name?
Mr. Belknap,
Mark Baker.
Mrs. Curran,
Baker.
Mr. Bonema,
Mark Baker.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Baker.
Mr. Zylstra,
Mark Baker,
Mr. Moss,
Mark Baker.
Mrs. Ebel,
Mark Baker.
Mrs. Medema,
Mark Baker.
8 votes for Mark Baker.
All right, we will recommend Mark Baker under the full Board of Commissioners. Action item 11, looking at the Ottawa County Land Bank Authority, is to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the names of Terry DeHaan, Michael Bosch, and Vince Bush, and to select one to fill one township representative seat vacancy beginning January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2029. First, is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All right, please remember when we're voting to pick one person for the seat.
Mr. Belknap,
Terry DeHaan.
Mrs. Curran,
Duhan.
Mr. Bonema,
Vince Bush.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Terry DeHaan.
Mr. Zylstra,
Vince Bush,
Mr. Moss,
Terry DeHaan.
Mrs. Ebel,
Terry DeHaan.
Mrs. Medema,
Terry DeHaan.
6 votes for Terry DeHaan.
Okay, we will recommend Terry DeHaan onto the full Board of Commissioners as our recommended choice from Talent Recruitment. Action item 12 is looking at the Ottawa County Officers Compensation Commission. It is to place into nomination and forwarded to the Board of Commissioners the names of Mark Brower, Craig Dunlap, Angela Loreth, Lynn Jansen, and to select 4 to fill 4, excuse me, member seat vacancies beginning January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2027.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All right, so we have 4 names and please list 4 people as we make our vote.
Mr. Belknap,
The 4 would be Mark Brower, Craig Dunlop, Angela Loreth, Lynn Jansen.
Mrs. Curran,
Bauer, Dunlap, Loreth, and Jansen.
Mr. Bonema,
Brower, Dunlap, Loreth, and Jansen.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Brower, Dunlap, Loreth, and Jansen.
Mr. Zylstra,
Brower, Dunlap, Dorth, and Jensen.
Mr. Moss,
Brower, Dunlap, Loreth, and Jansen.
Mrs. Ebel,
Brower, Dunlap, Lorath, Jansen.
Mrs. Medema.
Brower, Dunlap, Lorath, and Jansen.
They all received 8 votes.
All right, we will forward all 4 names on to the full Board of Commissioners as our recommendation. Looking at action item 13, it's coming, the motion is from Ottawa County Parks and Recreation Commission to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the names of Lucas Hill, Bruce Greenlee, Mark Brower, Michael Seagar, Joyce Cortman, Nathan Hoekstra, Lynn Jansen, Samuel Guffey, Benjamin Genzer, Mark Southwell, Michaela Ringquist, Amy Elderink, Kate Harmon, Joyce Cawthon, Karen Capricio. And to select 2 to fill 2 public seat vacancies beginning January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2026.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All right, as we vote, please list 2 names that you would like to vote for.
Mr. Belknap,
Lucas Hill, Bruce Greenlee,
Mrs. Curran,
Hill and Greenlee.
Mr. Bonema,
Hill and Hoekstra.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Hill and Greenlee.
Mr. Zylstra,
Lucas Hill, Kate Harmon.
Mr. Moss,
Hill and Greenlee.
Mrs. Ebel,
Hill and Greenlee.
Mrs. Medema.
Lucas Hill and Bruce Greenlee.
Hill with 8 votes and Greenlee with 6.
Both of those names will be recommended onto the full Board of Commissioners. Action item 14 is Ottawa County Veteran Affairs Committee. Suggested motion is to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the names of Patrick Muir, Robert Linderman, Dale Moore, Donald Dykstra, Bruce Greenlee, Stephen Prince, Jan Ennis, Brad Dorland, David Chesney, Stephen Davis, Larry Jackson, Todd Holmquist, and to select 2 to fill 2 war veteran seat vacancies beginning January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2026.
So moved.
Support.
Any discussion? All right, please list 2 names with your vote.
Mr. Belknap,
Patrick Muir, Robert Linderman,
Mrs. Curran,
Muir and Linderman.
Mr. Bonema,
Muir and Linderman.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Muir and Linderman.
Mr. Zylstra,
Brad Dorland and Larry Jackson.
Mr. Moss,
Muir and Linderman.
Mrs. Ebel,
Muir and Linderman.
Mrs. Medema,
Patrick Muir and Robert Linderman.
Muir and Linderman each have 7 votes.
We'll recommend both those names onto the full Board of Commissioners. The next action item comes from West Michigan Regional Planning Commission, and it is to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the names of Benjamin Genzer, Terry DeHaan, Mark Brower, Ryan Anderson, Rebecca Hopp, and Michaela Ringquist, and to select 1 to fill 1 Ottawa County private sector seat vacancy beginning January 1, 2024 and ending December 31, 2024.
So moved.
support,
Any discussion? Seeing none, please list 1 name with your vote.
Mr. Belknap,
Benjamin Genser,
Mrs. Curran,
Gensner.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Oh,
Oh, sorry.
Gensner.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Oh, sorry. Mr. Bonema,
Benjamin Genser.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Genzer.
Mr. Zylstra,
Rebecca Hopp,
Mr. Moss,
Genzer.
Mrs. Ebel,
Genzer.
Mrs. Medema.
Benjamin Genzer.
7 votes for Benjamin Genser.
All right, we will forward Benjamin Genzer's name on as a recommended to the full Board of Commissioners for the seat. That brings us up to our last action item, number 16, Ottawa County Department of Health and Human Services Board. The suggested motion is to place into nomination and forward to the Board of Commissioners the names of Robert Vanderswag, Kimberly Vanderlei, Mark Brower, Gwendolyn Fossey, Marcia Manning, Valerie Forsch, Benjamin Genzer, Brenda Vandermeulen, and Michaela Ringquest, and to select one to fill one county resident seat vacancy beginning January 1, 2024, and ending December 31, 2026.
So moved.
Support.
Any discussion? All right, seeing none, please state one name that you would like to serve on the seat.
Mr. Belknap,
Robert Vanderswag.
Mrs. Curran,
Vanderswag.
Mr. Bonema,
Kimberly Venderly.
Mrs. Rhodey,
Vanderswag.
Mr. Zylstra,
Robert Vanderswine.
Mr. Moss,
Vanderswag.
Mrs. Ebel,
Vanderswag.
Mrs. Medema.
Robert Vanderswag.
6 for Robert Vanderswag.
Was it 6 or 7?
I believe Bonema voted for Vanderlee. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and then Zylstra for Vanderlee as well.
No.
No, he said
Vanderswag.
Vanderswag.
Oh, I'm sorry. So it's 7, sorry.
I was just making sure. All right,
Okay.
so with 7
Voted
votes
with
for
3
Robert
Republicans.
Vanderswag, we will recommend his name on to the full Board of Commissioners. All right, that ends our action items today. There's no committee reports today, and we are up to our second opportunity for public comment. And just, is there anyone that would like to make a public comment at this time? Seeing none, I just want to say thank you to the many people that applied to serve in a variety of ways through our county. It was a true joy getting to meet many of them over the Teams app that we had. And I just want to say thank you for putting yourself out there and for being willing to be interviewed and your desire to serve. So we are at the end of our meeting, and with that, we are adjourned.